Um, yes, just as a quick background, there we go. Just as a quick background, I've lived in Carlsbad, New Mexico now for the past 14 and a half years, but I still consider San Antonio home. I get back there a couple times a year at least to visit family, friends, take care of things, and still do a lot of my research there. I like to annoy my New Mexican neighbors by telling them that Carlsbad is within the boundaries of the Republic of Texas. Uh, some of them don't have a sense of humor about that. But more seriously, though, I'm here to talk about Cibolo Creek, the Lower Glen Rose Aquifer, and traffic around Veni. And first of all, I should introduce the National Cave and Karst Research Institute, where I'm the executive director. In 1998, Congress realized that 25% of the country was karst or some related similar terrains. And so they created the Institute, partnering with the state of New Mexico, which matched the federal funding in the city of Carlsbad, which built our headquarters, hence the star that you see in southeast New Mexico, 30 miles from the state line. And so they established us there as the national authority on caves and karst. I'll point out that we are not a consulting company or an advocacy organization. We do consulting type research, but our interest is in doing research that might have broad applications. Our purpose is to provide the best available research and information about caves and karst. And Congress gave us these mandates here that you're welcome to read if you want, but in summary, they just say that we were established to conduct, support, facilitate, promote cave and karst research, education, management, archiving of data, and collaborations that support all of the above, both nationally and to some level internationally. One of my other hats is I'm the president of the International Union of Speleology, which is essentially the United Nations of cave exploration and science countries. And this year is the International Year of Caves and Karst. I'm jumping around to this meeting from coordinating a meeting at UNESCO headquarters in Paris, where we'll be celebrating, having a major celebration of the year in September. So anyway, that's the basic background. Let's get into the local situation. This is a geologic map of the area. If you haven't seen it, we've got Interstate 10 moving diagonally across the area. Here's Veni, 46 going west to east across the area. And so the issue, of course, is traffic flow. Some of what I'll cover will, at least to start with, will be introductory or old news to some of you, but it's just, I think it's useful to give these presentations starting from a level playing field. So rerouting traffic. I've talked about this with a number of people. One idea that immediately comes to mind, I've worked with TxDOT on a number of projects. I had my own consulting company for 20 years when I was in San Antonio. And so one thought is, well, route it to the west of Veni. Well, that ain't gonna work. It's attractive in that you've got this lighter green area, which is the upper member of the Glen Rose Formation. And it has an aquifer, but it is a small aquifer. It's not a very sensitive aquifer. So in that regard, it's a nice idea. But if you look at all these lines crunched together, these are topographic contour lines. It tells you that this is a hilly, rugged area. And so it'd be very expensive to do it. But more fundamentally, that's not where the traffic is. The traffic, of course, is out to the east along Highway 46. So another option, of course, would be to look at Ralph Fair Road, 3351. And it has the advantage, it's already there. And expanding that road has reduced cost options and benefits, but it has complexities that only a small portion of it is, of course, in Kendall County. A big chunk is in Comal, a big chunk in Bear, San Antonio ETJ, adjacent to Camp Stanley, and that has certain complications. The other problem is that still fundamentally the issue is traffic. And as I understand the problems going on, and from recent visits, most of the traffic is occurring closer to Veni, suburban development in the Veni area, and how to route or reroute that traffic. And so the logical place to put it solely in terms of traffic flow is to put a road somewhere over here, connecting 46 to I-10. So logically that makes sense, but we just can't look at, traffic flow. Of course, we need to think about other issues. Any good engineer or geologist looking at this who may not be familiar with the area will, of course, notice the geologic map, and it shows right next to that line is Cascade Caverns. Now, I'm not here to focus about Cascade Cavern, but what it would tell an engineer or a geologist is, wait a minute, if there's a cave that's showing up on the regional geologic map, that tells me that this dark green area is the lower member of the Glen Rose, and it tells me that this is, in fact, a very cavernous, a highly karstified unit. In fact, the lower Glen Rose has the longest caves in Texas, and these are all underground stream caves, one of which you can easily visit, which is Cave Without a Name, just to the north of you near Kreitzberg. So let's zoom in and think about this and look at it a bit more closely. So looking at it more closely, some of the issues and questions of concern are putting a bridge over Cibolo Creek. So let's look at Cibolo and karst features. And what we have in Cibolo Creek, and if we focus on the Kendall portion of Cibolo Creek, we have features known as swallets, 5 swallets. Another term for these are swallow holes. These are holes that take all the flow of the creek, or most of the flow, depending on how much water is moving down the creek. This is the highest concentration of stream swallets that I know of in the state of Texas. And I'm one of the managers of the Texas Speleological Survey. It's a nonprofit organization that manages the data on Texas caves. And I still manage the data for Bexar, Comal, and Kendall counties. So it's a high concentration. If we look at the Comal, Bexar County portion of Cibolo Creek, over here, 3 swallets are known. And it's worth pointing out, and I'll make this point repeatedly, that we really haven't searched this entire area. These are features that have been just casually found by people walking around, having to stumble across them. These are not from a detailed, thorough search of these areas looking for karst features. So what's a swallet look like? This is one from the Comal, Bexar County portion. Originally, we knew of it as a cave entrance up here above the creek bank, and most of the flow of the creek would just go right past it. But the cave went under the creek, and then some years later, it collapsed in, and now all the water of Cibolo Creek goes down it, and only major floods actually get past this feature. Now, my friend here, if he steps into this cave and climbs on down, it wouldn't take him very long to reach the water table. A point I frequently make is that I have been swimming in your water supply. I've been down in the lower Glen Rose aquifer. I've been down in the Edwards aquifer and other aquifers in Texas. And the point of that is that I'm a giant contaminant. I'm not getting filtered out. So things a lot skinnier than me, like oils, grease, bacteria, heavy metals, pesticides, herbicides, anything that may be in urban runoff, anything that may be in the spill, will easily get to the aquifer and have effectively no filtration in that process. And so this is one of many examples of these swallets going right down to water. So let's jump away from Cibolo Creek for a moment and take a look at the Mississippi River. This is Google Earth image. The Mississippi is this brown stream going through here, over a mile wide. And I've highlighted it with the blue line here to show you to make it easier to see the route of the river. But we see these funny features and lobes here to the side. And what these are the former route of the Mississippi. Rivers don't stay in one place. And so at one point, the Mississippi meandered back and forth along this route, and then more recently it cut its way through and straightened its channel, and with time this straighter channel will meander again. You can see more curves and arcs here and other places showing that this, the river was all over the place. So why do we care about meanders? Because most streams, including the Cibolo, meander. Additionally, and part of the definition, the major definition of karst, is it's an area formed by dissolving away of the bedrock. Water is naturally acidic. And so the more water you have in the location, the more the rock will be dissolved, the fractures will be dissolved, sinkholes will form, caves will form, fractures will get larger. Essentially, permeability, the ability of the water, of the rock to transmit water, increases the more water you have. So the highest permeability, and therefore the highest vulnerabilities to contamination, are in creek bed areas and their floodplains where the streams had meandered and increased that permeability over time. So if we move back to the Cibolo and we don't look at the creek bed now, but just look at the floodplain, I know of 4 caves and sinkholes in the Kendall portion of the Cibolo floodplain, and 4 caves and sinkholes in the Bear Comel portion of the Cibolo floodplain. And again, these are just the ones that are known. Now, what do these things look like? This is the best example, the biggest example I can show you. This is not Cibolo Creek in flood. The Cibolo is back over here in the distance. What this is this is a natural stream channel that goes to Cascade Cavern. And the reason I'm taking this photo from where I'm at is because long ago, the owners of Cascade built a dam to keep the Cibolo from flooding the cave. And so I took this photo some years ago, standing on top of the cave, facing down toward the creek. So this keeps the floodwaters from just pouring into the cave. But does it stop water from getting into the cave? No, because water will go into cracks and crevices and other sinkholes and other caves all over the area. And in fact, Cascade Caverns will flood. Most of the floods we never see. At least in the tourist part. They happen in the lower levels of the cave. They rise and fall and never reach the tourist trail. But some of them occasionally do reach the tourist trail, and the cave will flood out. So just because we stop the water from entering at this location doesn't mean that the cave doesn't flood. But Cascade is one of many caves, that formed by floodwaters along Cibolo Creek. Additionally, and one of the reasons I keep saying that these are the ones that we know about is this one swallow hole that opened up about 5 years ago. So here's the creek, and just off to the side, buried under about 2 to 3 feet of gravel and alluvium, is the cave entrance. It's been there for a long time. It formed when the Cibolo Creek was actually over this spot, almost certainly. But then as the creek meandered over, it deposited the gravel behind. As a result, with time though, continued floods have now washed that gravel down into this thing. There's another sinkhole over here that just out of the photo, hidden by the vegetation and rocks. And so when I see these things, I have to wonder how many more are there that we don't know about? Is there one here, here, here on the other side of the creek? We don't know. Geophysics and other tools can be used to try to look for these things. And when we do look, we tend to find them. So these things open and close. There's others that have opened and closed in historic time. Actually mostly opened. I don't know of any that have closed recently in historic time. So there's quite a number of features out there, both known and certainly unknown. Now, currently, focusing just on Kendall County, there are 83 caves and sinkholes known in that area. And again, that's a minimum number because we don't know what exists that may be covered up. This is not based on a detailed, thorough grid search of the area. And in fact, one of the 83 data points is a data point in my database that says many sinkholes in this area. So, and there's no doubt about it. No one's just going out to catalog how many those many sinkholes are. So, so we have an obvious area of concern, a highly karstified area. And I don't know of such a concentration of caves and sinkholes, except in the lower Glenrose. And this is the highest concentration I know in the lower Glenrose, except for one area near Spring Branch, which is also in the lower Glenrose. But that area has also been intensively surveyed and walked to find features where this area hasn't. So I have no doubt that walking this area will find many more. So If we take the photo that I showed you just a minute ago, but shoot that photo from the other angle, well, at this point, we can see the hole in the ground down here. And that's formed along a fracture. So without a doubt, it's capturing some water from down here under these soils and sediments. But the other concern is we've got this bridge. And what is that? Is that Battle Intense, Keeneland Drive? One of those. Anyway, it was built since I moved to Carlsbad. But look at this pier here. Imagine putting this pier over something like this. Building in karst areas is always tricky, not just from the contamination point of view, but also land stability. Now, in Texas, we are fortunate that sinkhole collapse is not a big issue. It's not unheard of, but it's not a big issue, but it's also something that certainly must be considered as we work and develop and build in karst areas. So last slide here, solutions. And as I put here at the bottom, there are no easy options. This is a Google Earth image of the area, of course, Interstate 10, the east edge of Bernie here, 46 shoots up to the northeast there, Almond Road cuts across. We see a lot of development around Bernie along the interstate, the Fair Oaks, properties over here up in this area. We have this broad undeveloped area here in the middle, which is the vulnerable karst area. The area in question that logically for traffic flow at least would make the most sense to find a way to weave through all of this existing development and connect to I-10. The sign here to the left is from a project I did for TxDOT in North Austin. I think this was 2015. And they put these signs at either ends of the study area, letting people know we're entering a karst zone. They had my crew out there during the entire 5 months of the project, being there on call nonstop, ready to move at a moment's notice if they found during construction a karst feature that needed some special attention or consideration. And so they would go out, do an evaluation, bring in more help if needed, or just give them the go ahead, yeah, you can go ahead and proceed. Karst areas are difficult, challenging environments. And so just to summarize and explain some of the challenges. The first one, complicated flow paths. If contaminants get into a karst aquifer, it's hard to say where they're going to go. These aquifers don't function the same way that many aquifers do. If you go south to the Carrizo-Wilcox aquifer, it's a sandstone aquifer. Water moves in a uniform pattern. It's really easy to build computer models and predict how and where that water is going to move. That doesn't work though in karst. Water's highly channelized, very complicated flow paths. You also have rapid flow. The global average velocity is 1 mile a day in karst aquifers. Now, that average is in generally wetter climates than what we see in Central Texas. But from dye tracing I've done in the area, let's see, I did a trace in the Edwards aquifer during flood conditions, and I got speeds of about 2 miles a day. I've also done traces during drought conditions that were much lower, probably averaging about 1/4 mile a day. Now, let's stick with 1/4 mile for the moment, because wellhead protection regulations, I haven't looked at them in Texas for a few years, but I believe they're still the same. And they're the same around much of the country. What they say is you need to protect the area within 1/4 mile of your wellhead, of where you're getting of where that public water supply is from. Well, if your water's flowing, 1/4 mile to 1 mile a day, that doesn't give you any lead time to turn off that water, to prevent contamination, to develop other supplies if a contamination episode happens. So that's some of the complexities that we deal with karst. No filtration, effectively no filtration in karst aquifers. As I've said, I've been swimming in your water supply. I don't taste very good and I didn't get filtered out. Many engineers have the mistaken idea that sealing recharge features, sealing karst features will protect karst groundwater. And that's not true. That's not true. Again, going back to the example with Cascade Caverns, they built the dam and it keeps the immediate floodwaters from Cibolo Creek from flooding the cave, but the cave still floods by water quickly moving into the ground through fractures, sinkholes, and other caves all over the place. And most recharge features are not seen. Many of them are hidden under soil that, like the one I showed you about along Cibolo Creek that washed open, and many are hiding in plain sight. There are so many geologic assessments I've looked at where people see all these cracks around the ground and they just don't say anything about them. I tell people, go out when it's raining. You know, don't just go out in nice weather, go out when it's raining and look at these cracks. And you'll see that many of them, water will flow along the surface and go into this crack and not make it to the other side because it's recharging quickly. One of the last dye traces I did when I was in Texas was for the Hydrological Authority. We went out to the north side of town, Blanco Road in 1604. I found a flat piece of ground, no caves, no sinkholes, no karst features. I dug about 4 inches into the dirt, about 3 foot square, and then ran a hose to it and let the hose run for a month. Now, that hole that I dug was just to hold the water, and it had about a 20-gallon capacity. During those 4 weeks of running that hose, I put it close to 29,000 gallons of water into that 20-gallon hole, and it never overflowed. I put some dye into that water, and it showed up 2 miles away in a well. And so this is an area where by all of our current standards would not even be rated as a sensitive location or a feature. And yet 29,000 gallons of water went down this hole in 4 weeks, and the dye went 2 miles away to a water well. So that leaves us with the last point here, that when you're dealing with karst, the entire karst area, the entire recharge area is vulnerable, not just the features. So this is somewhat of a doom and gloom presentation. I recognize that. And that's just the reality of dealing with karst. It's not a political agenda, it's just the reality. At the same time, reality is society grows. Society is expanding. And in some places, society will expand and grow on karst. And so my job here for this presentation is to make you aware of the challenges. If you want to meet again and talk about solutions and possible options, I'd be glad to brainstorm with you. But my job here right now is to point out the challenges that exist. I thought about trying to propose some things and whatever, but it's like, wait, you know, I don't want to get into the weeds. You guys have already probably looked at many of these things in more detail than I have, and I'd just be reinventing the wheel. I liken working in karst, building, developing in karst, much like to getting into your car. When I get into my truck, I know that I can die in that vehicle. And so I'm informed about the challenges. And so I put on my seatbelt. And damn it, I want that airbag too. I want that extra measure of protection because, like I said, I can die in there. Likewise with karst. It's complicated, it's highly sensitive. People have died because of karst groundwater contamination. And so if development, if building on karst will happen, if it cannot be avoided, then be aware of the challenges. Do it in the most intelligent, the most sensitive manner possible, because none of us wants our water contaminated. None of us wants our environment degraded. No one wants to see anyone get sick or ill or see damage because of a collapsed sinkhole that collapses a pier, that collapses the road. So that's the gist of my presentation, just to let you know that, yeah, there are challenges. Again, if you'd like to talk more about some of this, I'd be glad to talk now or meet with you at a later time. My next trip to Texas will be, well, I'm still working that out. I may actually be in town very briefly in September, but then I'll be back longer in late October, early November for a conference. And I'll be leading a field trip through, Kendall, Comal counties in the Lower Glen Rose. So any questions? And I can stop sharing my screen at this point. So.
Well, Dr. Veni, I'm Don Durden. I'm one of the co-chairs of the committee, and I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. I think that there are a number of questions here. I don't know, can you hear or see the rest of the room?
I see one side of it, so I see some folks.
Ben, say something, see if he can hear you.
Well, yeah, I guess I do have a question. It's a broad stroke question because you said you have all these ideas that you could offer. But I do wonder, are there best practices for constructing in a karst recharge zone that actually work, that are actually effective for protecting water quality?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually something that we're developing on. One of my other hats is that I'm chairing a subcommittee within ASTM. If you're not familiar, ASTM is one of two international standards organizations, and they design standards for everything from the chair you're sitting on to make sure it's stable and safe, to how to test different materials and procedures and so forth. And so I've got an international team working on such standards. There are a variety of methods that have been used. There have been attempts to try to do this. One of the challenges is what I describe as many flavors of karst. And while karst areas in general are defined as landscapes formed by dissolving away the bedrock, the degree of dissolution, the different shapes of the landscapes and landforms vary according to local geology and other factors. And so what works great in Virginia may not work as well in Central Texas, and what works in New Mexico here may be a little bit different. And so trying to come up with a holistic approach is one of the challenges that we're doing. Some years ago, what was 1999, I published a couple of papers on a strategy of how to do environmental impact assessments in karst. And it really defaults to the fact that you need to look at the local situation and collect a lot of local data. But behind it, it provides general guidelines of the approach to take. I'd be more than happy to share it. It was based on, well, the idea behind this was actually based on, well, back then it wasn't TCQ, it was what, TNRCC. But they had these guidelines to assess recharge features for the Edwards. And they weren't based on dye tracing, on geophysics, on any advanced method. They were based on simply walking through the field and looking, okay, yep, that's a hole in the ground. And I'm not trying to make light of it. But it was what I call a geomorphological assessment. You look at the size and shape. Some people, depending who you're working for, they won't even let you go into a cave if it's a cave because they're concerned about safety. And yet you're supposed to say something about it. So I tried to develop a methodology that improved the assessment method. In the end, what happened was I was working extensively at Camp Bullis, and I had this extensive database from Camp Bullis. I was also doing some work at Government Canyon and other places where we looked at these karst features, some of which were open caves, some which depressions in soil that we dug down to either a crack, to a cave, to a flat bedrock pan. And using that, where I knew what it looked like to start off with, and I knew what it was after careful assessment, I developed a method to project and say, all right, how best can I predict, these features, their vulnerability? And then I applied that to using the TCQ method for the same group of features. Essentially, they got it right about 33% of the time and underestimated the majority of the time. My method got it right, I think, like 75, 77% of the time. And if you added like 5 or 10 minutes of moving some rock and dirt and soil around, I got it up to about 95% accuracy. TCQ asked me if we could apply that regionally, but it was based on some very specific features of the geology that I looked at. And so I said, yeah, it would work in one part of the edges, but I'd have to look at the other parts to apply it more regionally. Likewise, I'd have to make some adjustments and collect data to apply it to the upper or to the lower Glen Rose. But there are methods like that, but there's no international standard at the moment. We're trying to build one.
Dr. Veni, one of the, it's a very complex system. It's not just the geology. We also have property boundaries that we have to look at. And if we were just engaging in an academic exercise that said, okay, we want to examine extending a road from Highway 46 to Interstate 10. And let's just say we're going to look at the first consideration, not the most important, but the most obvious one, property boundaries. If we can find a route, say, okay, let's examine that route to see how it affects the karst features and the ecology of the area. Is that the right way to approach this, or you're better off looking at all the caves and trying to pick a route that, respects that first?
One of the best projects I've done in that regard was on the north side of Austin for Loop 45. And TxDOT said, look, we've got to alleviate traffic. We need to connect, Mopac to 620. And we need to put a road in here somewhere. And so they contracted me, and we went out, we didn't search all of the area between Mopac and 620. It's an absurdly large area, but within a certain target range, we went out and searched those properties and just did what I call a phase 1 survey, just that rough initial morphological assessment. And then based on that assessment, tweaking the methodology that I use for that area to come up with a high, medium, low ranking of vulnerability. We color coded those features on the map. And so TxDOT then looked at those and said, okay, so how about if we weave the highway in this way, which means we would take out these certain features. And these are features, we can't avoid all of the features, but we can avoid some of them. And so they said, go and take a look at these features. And so we went and dug, and we found important recharge, we found endangered species and other issues. So then they rerouted again and rerouted again. Finally, they found a path of least resistance. And there was one feature there, and I said this cave doesn't look like much from the surface, but it's part of a deeper system. We're just seeing the top of a collapse, and they wanted to push it to make sure that they did everything right. And so I went out, did some geophysics, found the underlying cave. Sure enough, aquifer issues, endangered species, and so forth. In the end, they ended up putting the road over that cave. But that was the only option that they had. And then they did some deals with U.S. Fish and Wildlife to protect those species in other areas and so forth. But I think there's a path to focus an area, to say, okay, here's a target area. You don't need to look at everything, from Herf Road down to the county line. You don't need to look at everything, but here's, let's say a 1 mile or half mile wide area. Go study and see what's there, based on property values, whatever, factors you want to consider. And then, come back and see what those results are. And that would be a relatively low cost way just to do a phase 1 and survey to say, yeah, there is 1,001 features out there. They look like there's a high chance of having aquifer issues. There's no endangered species issues in this area. Those are limited down south to Bexar County. And then you can decide, yeah, we're going to abandon it, or no, we're going to go ahead and we'll do a phase 2 study and then think about it a little bit more. So you can do it stage wise, and that's an option. I wouldn't recommend just looking at the whole region. That could be quite expensive.
Other questions?
The question is, what do we need to ask for as a committee to even consider additional roads in the different regions, like the Northeast, the Southeast, the Northwest, which have been proposed? Is there a way that we can get on a more macro level before we zone in on a smaller territory?
One thing you can do, and I mentioned the Texas Speleological Survey. I was past president of the TSS and stepped down when I moved to New Mexico. I still work as a data manager, but it has a data request process. Generally, TSS does not just put all its data, especially locations, on the website for people to see. They respect private property owners, and that sometimes kids will find this area, find this information and go and hurt themselves, in caves. And so there is a data request process, and you can apply to TSS and say, hey, we're trying to figure out what to do. We need information, and then they will decide, what they'll, chances are they'll give you some data. If whether they give all of it or not, I'm not on the board. I don't know what their choices would, what their response would be. I would expect and hope that they would provide it to a governmental agency that would try to keep the data proprietary as much as possible. We recognize that there's a Texas Open Records Act, that nothing can be fully strictly protected at times. But for the broader public good, I think and hope that they would approve it. The Texas Speleological Survey, I'd probably have to spell speleological for you, but it's txspeleologicalsurvey.org. Actually, I'll just put that in the, I'll just put the link in.
I'm already talking to Andy Glusenkamp over there.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Great. So and Andy is in charge of data requests. And in fact, one of the things that I'm about to do is a massive update of data into the TSS that I've been collecting. I've been working on some projects that were pretty complex, and so I wanted to finish those projects. So they're going to be getting a massive update, including a lot of information for this area. So they'll be getting an update soon.
Going back to one of your maps, you mentioned the darker green area is I believe it was the lower Glen Rose.
Yes.
And that one of the options for moving traffic north to south is 3351. And it seemed like 3351 crossed this karst area with 4 or 5 swallowets above and 4 or 5 below it. So I'm trying to frame in my mind which is better, to have 2 smaller crossings in that area or to expand 3351, because if that is one of the options, do you have any sense about which one would be better or less risky?
What I can tell you, like I say, most of the area has not been searched, but some of it has. I mentioned Camp Bullis earlier. I did a lot of work at Camp Bullis, and we walked all of the Cibolo on Camp Bullis. And that one feature that I showed you, that one swallow that I showed you is on Bullis. And I can say that there are fewer swallowets downstream of 3351 than upstream. That upstream portion has more, and we haven't even looked at that area fully. So I'd be more concerned with an upstream location than the downstream location of 3351. Additionally, you already have traffic there. Now, I can't get into the cost. I'm not an engineer or a road builder, but the fact that you would not have as much, I'm assuming you wouldn't have as much of a property issue. You wouldn't have some of those costs. You wouldn't have as many environmental studies to do. You'd certainly have to put in some hazmat traps around Cibolo Creek, because right now it's just, of course, well, is it still a low water crossing, or has a bridge been built over it? I'm trying to remember. A lot's changed in the past 14 and a half years. But factors like that would need to be considered. But the fact that you already have traffic there, is one thought. Another thought that I'd consider, just, and these aren't, they all have pros and cons. And this would be difficult, but potentially feasible, is Herf Road, expanding that and connecting it in. It has the benefit of being off the Glenrose, or off the lower Glenrose, but it's still just upstream of the lower Glenrose where all the Swallowts are at. It's a much shorter route, but you all know what that looks like in terms of development. That would be quite difficult. Another option that came to mind, and it comes to mind through a project I did around San Marcos, where they wanted to take Ranch Road 12, which was running right through the middle of town. And they had these big trucks and buses trying to navigate some of the narrow turns. And so they expanded that and essentially extended it through the Purgatory Creek floodplain. And there was a lot of concern about putting this right over the recharge zone just above San Marcos Springs. And what they decided was a parkway option. The idea being that there's no on or off ramps. They did put in one, but the idea of the parkway is no on or off ramps. It just gets you from point A to point B. In this case, it gets you from 46 to I-10. And therefore it minimizes traffic. And quite frankly, it also helps minimize and reduce development around that area, which would also be on the recharge zone for that Karst aquifer. Because if you have a lot of on and off ramps, then you're just increasing your risk of contamination from urban runoff, leaks from cars and vehicles, leaks from sewers and septic systems and whatever else. So you'd certainly want to minimize your urbanization of the lower Glenrose in general. So a parkway is, in my mind, one compromise option if you absolutely have to put it there. I remember working on one TxDOT project where they said, we want you to look at 3 routes. And I said, look, I don't want to talk myself out of a job, but I'll tell you right now, these 2 routes on the Karst, they're not going to work for you. They're going to be more expensive. You're going to have recharge features, you're going to have endangered species, you're going to have bridge work. Do this other option off the Karst. And they said, yeah, you're probably right, but we're required to look at all these options. And so, okay, we went out there, we did the searches. They ended up doing the other option just the same, as I recommended. Traffic studies require that you sometimes need to consider things like this. But if the traffic study really pushes it, like that Highway 45 project, they looked at other options, and in that case, they didn't keep it off the Karst. They just had to cut through. It was, but a parkway would be one compromise position potentially to consider.
Questions? I just think this was a very a fantastic presentation, Dr. Veni. A pleasure to get to meet you virtually. I think several times he made an offer to come back, maybe virtually again, and do some deep dives and stuff. I mean, I think we'd be silly not to take him up on that that offer. I don't have any immediate questions in my mind. But
well, and I mean that sincerely. Like I say, I still think of San Antonio as home. The hill country is home. That's I get back there and I just think I take a deep breath and smell that oak juniper mix, and it's like, this is my air, and so, but also I've got a lot of knowledge about the area. So it's not just that I'm the director of the National Institute, but I did my PhD research on the lower Glenrose aquifer along Cibolo Creek and the Guadalupe River. Bexar, Comal, Kendall counties, a little bit of Blanco County. So I know the area, and our job is at the Institute is to help and provide good data. We don't want to get into the middle of any big political discussions or wrangling or whatever. At times, there have been discussions. We haven't done it yet, but there have been considerations of, maybe bringing us in if there was a major debate, should we do X, Y, or Z? We can come in as independent evaluators, focusing on the science, focusing on karst and aquifers and so forth. We could provide that independent review. People, when I was in San Antonio, people would sometimes mistake me. I'd joke and say, people call me a cave hugger. I'm following the science. The science says that karst aquifers are incredibly vulnerable. If the science said that I could put a nuclear waste dump on top of my karst aquifer, I might not like it in principle, but I have to say go for it. There was a case out in West Texas back in the early 90s I was working on, where someone wanted to put a hazardous waste landfill on karst. And in principle, I hated the idea. But there was, without going into the details, there was something unique, really one of a kind in that area that made it feasible. And I had to admit that. And it's like, yep, I'm not thrilled with it, but yeah, that would work. In the end, they didn't get permitted, which was to my relief, because, my concern would be if they permitted that, people say, well, you can put hazardous waste dumps anywhere in karst. And no, that wasn't the case. But our goal is the science. We're not advocates except for just good information and good science, because ultimately that's what protects the people, is good science and the best available information.
Well, Dr. Veni, again, thank you very much. If you've done nothing else for us, I think it has reinforced the fact that we all exist in this area, in the drainage area that runs through this area. And what we do, even if it's off that lower Glen Rose, in our yards and with our trash and those things, has a potential impact on that. And so I think that we probably need to re-emphasize that in the broader community.
People will often they'll discount the impact of urban runoff. And I challenge people like that, next time it's raining, to go down to the street, to the curb, and scoop up a glass of that gray water and ask them if they would drink it. And I don't think anyone would. No one's taken me up on that. The other thing to do is that, and it's this, is to look sometimes at studies done by like the U.S. Geological Survey, looking at urban runoff. And I know I found this amazing the first time I saw it. The bacteria count, you'd think this was coming off of a barnyard, and it was simply after a while with no rain, that first storm washes all the dog and cat poop off of our yards and flushes that out. And the bacteria count, not counting oils and grease and the other nastier stuff, was just astounding. So yeah, urban runoff is an issue, and it's a challenge. Again, I'm not saying you can't do anything with karst. The Edwards Plateau, the Texas Hill Country, is one of the largest karst areas in the country. And you can't go in any direction very far without stepping on it. The most vulnerable stuff is the lower Glen Rose. If you go into the upper Glen Rose, you're better off, much better off there. But it's hillier, it's far more difficult to develop and work in. So.
Well, good luck in New Mexico. I've got relatives in New Mexico, and they always shared this insight about Texans with me. They said you can always tell a Texan, you just can't tell them much. So maybe they'll give you some perspective. Thank you again very much.
You bet. Anytime. Bye-bye.
Ben, thank you for making that happen. I think it's very good.
Back to Don. They're really good buddies, and he introduced him to me a long time ago, and we had a nice meal together, I'm blown away. Just truly blown away. And how much modesty.
Any other observations, thoughts?
I concur with Jonah about asking him for another session, you know, and then we can maybe work out what topics we might want. You know, from my perspective, maybe a more regional look at what's going on in the different segments around Veni. Do any of them lend themselves towards, you know, an opportunity if in fact we think we need that additional work. But I think it would be worthwhile. I know personally on that road, the guy across the road has a sinkhole, the neighbor 2 gates down has a sinkhole. You know, so I know that north of Veni, there are those kinds of places, and with the origin of Brown Creek up there, Spring Creek, my guess is there's probably, and I think we can help us understand.
I think that was a good point that Betsy asked earlier. I think she asked it well enough. I'm sitting here kind of like chemistry class. I know there's a lot of information I don't know, but I just don't know how to ask to get it. But I think it would be helpful for us to be able to look at Kendall County and look at each sensitive areas that we need to be aware of. I think we focused on this primarily for cause discussion. We brought up a couple of weeks ago about that cut from 46 to the southeast quadrant. I think it'd be helpful to have similar maps or at least an idea of what we're looking at for us.
I think one of the flaws of some of the previous work that's been done on transportation is not looking at the environmental perspective first, but rather looking at the engineering perspective and population growth and putting lines down, leaving the environmental for last. And I really like the idea of coming at it from the environmental perspective first, before we actually get into the rest of the conversation.
I think that's a valid point, because so much of the criticism of previous efforts was, okay, you're identifying a recommendation, spot on a map or what have you, but you haven't done environmental studies with it. So that might render those recommendations good. So it would make sense to know what we're dealing with up front.
Bob, I like what you, I'm sorry, Don, I like what you were saying at the, about, you know, we have these property boundaries that we're looking at, regardless of what part of the county is, you know, property boundary issues that we're thinking about, there's environmental issues, there's endangered species issues, and I mean, really, it's like we put a bunch of different layers on top of each other and try to find the opportunity that causes the least damage to the things that you care about the most. And to that effect, I wonder if it'd be possible. I mean, there's lots of Karst maps that we can get, but are there maps that show specifically the most sensitive areas? I mean, because if you're going to do any kind of development area near some Karst, obviously the best thing you can do is avoidance. Just do it somewhere else. That's option one. And then, you know, if you have to do it in some other area, or like where you're actually hitting the Karst, then there's some kind of mitigation you can do, or different kinds of measures that potentially minimize it. But I just wonder if there's something we can get from Dr. Veni, or maybe Donna, you know, that would give us really granular detail to help us look very close and say, you know, this is a specific spot we really should be avoiding, and things like that.
I'll follow up on that comment. So one of the things he mentioned was the areas that he knows, right? He mentioned the freeze wallets and the force wallets, and we don't know, because we have not studied our area as thoroughly as all the dollars that have been spent in studying campus and the doctor and that type of thing. We're way behind. We know that we have the same vulnerabilities, but we don't treat it the same level of urgency. This you mentioned the environmental factors, and I think the number one factor, let's not contaminate water supply. whether it's us drinking it, the person who has a well 2 miles from wherever that dive in, or the folks downstream. And so protecting the water supply is probably paramount because that's what we all need to live here or anywhere. Getting those studies done, like he was mentioning, if there's a potentially positive place where you can do a half-mile wide, survey, it takes time and you need the expertise and you need money. And I think that this committee doesn't have an allocation of funding to do that at this point. So I don't know what the steps are for you guys to do that, but that would be absolutely the first step. Because we don't. When I talk to George in many conversations, we talk about the swallows, but we know where those are. There's speakers that are taking things in that we don't know where they are. So you really have to treat the entire area as something. You can't just say, oh, give me 10 feet around that swallow and call it good. This is widespread. The Lower Glen Road is mapped really well. You know the extent of it, and you know that all of it is one. So that's where his talk in the future could help probably. But again, on the first or second slide that he showed, and he showed that the perfect spot would be on that side, Interstate 10, but there's no traffic there. And then you take into consideration topographic changes, and you're looking at a 20-year project to get a road through those fields and blasting.
And Donna, can you, my understanding of those types of surveys is that they are generally on the ground. People walking around on the ground looking for, it's not something you can do aerially.
That is correct. It's also being in search of rescue.
So-
You line up right next to each other, you're crawling on the ground, you're crawling through bushes. Because you need very dense vegetation area.
So that if that's the
It's
case,
costly.
if that's the case, you not only need the money, the time, the expertise, you need access to the land. And so if it's private properties that people don't want on there, that's a whole nother ball of wax.
It's and the people that are doing the line have to. So you can't have just one person, like a doctor, an expert. You have to have multiple people that are doing that.
One of the things from listening to all this, first off, second, thanks again for this point of this subcommittee to educate us is terrific and it's powerful. But listening to a lot of his comments and things he said here, I want to ask that you at least consider as we move forward a couple of the aspects that make it manageable for this committee to actually move forward. And that would be, insofar as we can, with very limited resources and time and manpower and all that, think about whether we even need anything through there. If we do, can we, as a committee, pass that as a recommendation with a very strict set of sub-recommendations that this environmental work be done post-haste and be done thoroughly, and let's just get it right. This is not window dressing, we actually mean it. If you're not going to do it, then it's not a recommendation sort of thing. And secondly, Mr. Wurzbach Parkway here, the idea of a parkway design, we've talked about in this community a lot, and in some regards, it's a wonderful compromise if we're going to do it. People get on 46 and they get off at 10. There's no development going on in the middle of it, and there's no other exposure that wasn't absolutely necessary. So just food for thought if you're going to do anything over there. There's a couple of ways that we can make a recommendation without having to have $50 million to go do a thorough environmental assessment.
I will make one comment. I know the funding topic just came up 3 different times. One thing Dr. Veni could really shed some light on is the beta of the recharge. Where does it go? Who's the downstream user? Downgrading user as it gets subsurface. So, if you look at what City of Austin's done west of Austin, and what City of San Francisco's done to protect recharge west of Austin, outside the city limits, in the ETJ, funding, protection of recharge features. It's an extensive project. There's been a lot of talk about it, but if you could determine through a dice, a massive, I mean, it would be a huge undertaking in itself. If you understood who the end user was, perhaps you reach out to the Edwards Aquifer Authority or City of San Antonio, wherever you determine that this recharge is with benefit, they could and then try to fund its protection up here in the county. Just one factor to try to pursue funding from other entities. I'll spread the costs around a little bit. You want to talk about that?
So there's some studies that are out there that suggest that the water that is recharged in Cibolo Creek is going to the northeast, going towards San Marcos Springs, Guadalupe River, that type of thing. Just like Ryan just said, the nitrate is definitely complicated. As a trustee of the Cibolo Reserve, I've been working for the last 5 years trying to get studies done on the reserve that tell us where this water goes. It's not a master's thesis. It's definitely not a PhD work. I mean, this is something that would be an interagency, national USGS, very big scope project. And it's very complicated. So funding for it has never come to fruition. I continue to work away at it. Speaking with USGS now on projects that can help us understand the recharging a little bit better, but even they are slow. Any other bureaucratic entity to get things moving. So I wish it had already happened. Again, we're behind the curve a lot, but we keep coming away at it, trying to really figure it out. Whether or not, well, just like I guess San Antonio, right, purchased a lot of land out towards the wall of other water sources. If we conclusively could say that 17 billion gallons of water from the Cibolo are going to San Marcos, that, but how would they protect? How would they purchase land? I mean, so because we're already going, that could be a long conversation.
Well, as a county commissioner, I'll say I'm as worried about development in that area as I am, maybe even more so about development and additional transportation facilities, and our inability to regulate and control that development is very concerning to me, regardless of who is the beneficiary of the underground water resources.
And Cow Creek resonates with that. We've been having discussions accordingly. We're trying to find a way to make responsible development. If development is to happen, we want it to be as responsible as it can be.
Lance, you had your hand up a while ago.
Okay.
John, just a quick thought, because there's water involved, could we possibly access ARPA funds as a springboard, get things started, and then find other funding sources?
What an interesting thought, Bob. As you know, we have started that conversation, and we are going to have a facilitated additional conversation with some national experts that may be able to help us fund some groundwater modeling. I don't think it's going to be, I don't know yet. They're working on getting a cost estimate from a hydrogeologist and to see if we can fund it with the county share. And, you know, perhaps the city of Veni would be willing to join in that. So it remains to be seen whether we can sell it, but it is a water resources deal. There is some money allocated for water infrastructure. And talked with the Hill Country Alliance representative today. Their national liaison said there may be some additional sources of money. So we're gonna see what we can find. Let me get to Lyle and then come back. Go ahead, Lyle.
Yeah, as Don was saying, the USGS stuff is limited in Kendall County. It's kind of superficial. They definitely need to get some more funding, and they are whining about not getting enough funding for Kendall County. They're still trying to do it. We've been trying for at least 10 years to get the Cascade Cavern salamander on the endangered species list. But the budgeting process in DC keeps pushing it off and pushing it off and pushing it off. Another thing, besides USGS, we hear the TCEQ maps are also insufficient. And we suspect the Lily Ranch project is right on top of a huge recharge zone that's never been, hit with, LiDAR or ground penetrating radar. The features aren't very visible on the surface there around Lily Ranch, but a lot of them may be, concealed, by farmers and, other things.
You gotta
Also
watch those
mentioned,
farmers.
I want to comment a little bit on what Bitsy said earlier about the Northeast quadrant. After the Southeast quadrant with at least 83 documented caves, the Northeast quadrant is probably, pretty close. I mean, you've got about 5 clusters of about 5 cave clusters in Kendall County. You've got the Cibolo Cascade area, but you've also in the Northeast, or roughly the Northeast quadrant, you've got Kreuzberg, you've got Kendalia, you've got Bergheim. And if you look at some of the TSS maps, which I think are probably right now going to be the most useful to see where some of these recharge features really are, if they'll give up some of that information. Yeah, those areas, those other 3 areas in the Northeast quadrant, I'm sure they've got at least 30, 40 documented caves each, especially around Kreuzberg and Cape without a name. It's insane around there. That's my comment.
Well, this has been quite eye-opening today from a completely different perspective. But considering that the vulnerability of our water system over Karst not only will affect people acutely around whatever project we go through there, but potentially for miles around, I do believe that going the environmental way first, which has been talked about for years, even back in 2010. We all talked about it. If the money's not there, perhaps there could be some sort of GoFundMe page, something that's done for environmental, philanthropists, people who are out there that might not be part of our community, but want to contribute. And it could amount to a good amount of money. It might not amount to a lot, but I do know that there are people out there that are really concerned, and there are people out in Cibolo County and the surrounding areas that I think it's important that we actually know what the risks are, because I myself, who suffer from kidney disease, just learned today about the acidity that can happen in this water, or it could potentially cause physical problems for people. That it's just a whole new perspective on this problem. And I think that the roads are in existence can be developed with turnarounds and as they have in other cities. But anyway, this was really wonderful today. On Lisa, if you're going, I remember you. Okay.
I have a question, maybe Donna, is there a central database of all of the Karst? Do the cavers have that information, that database that you guys were talking about? Is that the one?
Yeah, that's what Dr. Veni referred to when he was talking about the Texas Geological Survey, which Dr. Veni is one of the caretakers of,
right.
Maintains that, and when a feature is found, that landowner allows them to put it in the database, and then there's a legal document they sign that says they will not use the data, because a lot of people who have cases on the property don't want the property to know the liability. So they're very, if they take that to heart, they protect it. So they, like you mentioned, on their website, information request form that has to be done, and the person that's making the request has to make the case why they're doing what they're going to do for, et cetera, et cetera. So that's
I was just going to add that it's at
it's
least
not all inclusive. That's what I want.
and at least a few years ago when I was working with that database, the term database is real loose. It's a bunch of file cabinets in the basement, I think at UT, is that right? So it's literally like they didn't want to digitize it. I think they may have been trying to now, but you have to go down there and pull file cabinets, and you often have to pay someone to go to do that to dig up the data for certain counties and stuff. But it's not like they just type in a quick query and just send on it.
I think George is actually working on that for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
This
maybe-
question.
So that was about 5 years ago when I was working with it, so maybe
We do have a plotted version. And they also have some older reports.
for our county.
Yes.
But again, it's not all inclusive. And this is just what they know about.
So
It's not
maybe-
based on those, the data that TSS has acquired has been acquired over a long period of time by cavers, property owners, and cauldron. It's not based on a comprehensive survey, and that's the limitation that George is referring to in the areas that we've highlighted. That's just what we know. What we don't know is.
But you don't know might be twice as much as what you know.
Right, and we might find an area that we go in.
I'm being conservative.
An example was the area in Faroe Sand that was plotted out, oh, maybe 25 years ago. And it has, I would say, greater than 300 feet, and it's less than 70 feet. So when you actually do walk in, you start counting, you find it like, whoa, this is like walking. So.
All right, we are coming to time for us to close. I'd like to kind of review where we're going for the next meeting and start by saying this meeting was not on our schedule. You may recall we agreed to meet on the 1st and the 3rd Tuesdays, but because we skipped last week, it just happened. So this is the 5th Tuesday. If we hold to our schedule for the 1st and 3rd Tuesday, we will meet again a week from today. Everybody okay with that? Okay.
I was gonna try to line up, I was working with Jeff Carroll to try to line up a presenter for that, but I don't know that we can do it in that timeline. I'll talk to him. I think the gentleman, it's like consultant that is supposed to be in town anyways.
For the major thoroughfare plan.
Yeah, yes. We'll see.
I think it probably would be not enough time. I mean, considering Monday for most people is a holiday, so there are not many working days between now and then.
Not if you're retired.
I'll check with you. I'll check with him. We're gonna we wanted to introduce this concept. I've sort of been emailing a little bit with you guys about the whole wide nodes, narrow nodes. You know, it's an approach that's been used well in Europe and it may have applicability to facilitate better traffic flow with less concrete. Actually,
Bitsy is looking for the what?
The date?
The date is July the 6th. Right. Would your committee, you think, be able to have something meaningful for us to consider in terms of presenting to us some results and what you would like to see in a plan by Tuesday?
We are meeting tomorrow, so come around to the request one more time. You want from this committee to present a summary of the meeting or something else?
Well, I think y'all are coming up with a list of projects, is that correct? At some point in time by the end of July. Would you have a preliminary list of projects that you might say, these are the ones that I think that we're headed towards? And get some feedback from committee members.
Actually, they're included in the minutes.
Okay.
And they're not in the engineering formats, it's in the narrative. So just be mindful that that's from where I come from.
Well, and most people should be able to understand them, right?
Yes, with one exception, I still haven't got the Southwest map correctly on the minutes yet. So I will amend that, but so yeah, and they're not going to be terribly surprising. They're going to look a whole lot like the things that we talked about for years. And other than, I would simply say there are very few roads that don't already exist. The one being perhaps in the northwest the next couple of weeks to see. So, that right away is pretty much there. So at any rate, yeah, so the minutes clearly have all that narration in there, and we have maps. So.
But consider yourself on the agenda.
Yeah, there you
Bottom
go.
line. And I think between now and then, Bob and I will spend some time trying to get a hold of some of the appointing entities and make sure that we get this committee either reloaded or reduced, and we can look at that. And if possible, we will see if we can engage ANPO and get an answer on the data. I think that will be enough for the meeting in that short order.
And maybe I'll just add, Bob, you said that you mentioned that the mayor has indicated, let him know what we want. It might be worth just putting some feelers out if there's an opportunity to find somebody with some GIS skills, maybe on the city side, that can dedicate. It might be a day of time working on this.
I'm done, but I think the precursor to that has to be having our hands on the raw data for this person to use to work.
So speaking of raw data, not from AMBO per se, but the TSS that has the data on the caves. It would be nice to have maybe a conversation next time about what would be our specific ask for some data from them. I think that would be very helpful. And if you're going to talk to AMBO, what Projects Committee has been curious about, many people have, is what kind of data do they have about the nature of through traffic in downtown? Is it a trip outside the city? Is it a trip within downtown? Directionally, and that's the kind of data that we're not. When you get to downtown Bernie, I think it would be very helpful to have something like this BISD demographics kind of goes through when you're talking about the central city.
Okay. I'm not sure we'll be able to get that by Tuesday.
Okay, so the disclaimer is most of my team will be out of town next week, but I will forge ahead and may possibly for answering the question or two.
And we won't try to make the decisions, but I think you give some feedback about whether you're on the right track.
Okay, that'd be great.
Second and last chance today for public comment.
Tom Adelstein, I'm in Kendall Point, and I thought Dr. Veni was great. That was a great discussion. And it seems to me when we talk about all the money we're looking for to do these environmental studies, and you get back to what he says, it almost sounds like use the roads that you have because they're already out there. We have 3351, we have Hearth, maybe a parkway somewhere over Hearth, I don't know. It just seems that maybe sometimes we make it more difficult than it needs to be. And if we're going to do these environmental studies about a new road, we may be looking at many years before this gets done. The issue, I think, is people and the mayor and the judge wanted was, what can we do now? And that's a lot of what Bitsy has on her list. And I think that's a good focus. And again, he seems to make sense to use what you have. So thank you for letting me speak.
Ms. Taylor, thank you for being here. Steve, don't have anything to say today?